Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Good, but the world's a mess.
It's worse than ever.
I'll tell you. And there's a lot of panicking going on there.
Yeah.
You know, panic over, coronavirus.
Yeah.
And I can understand the degree of that, but sometimes I think there's a little hype in there and it's overdone. But there's also a panic in the financial markets because they were already deserving of a panic because of the mischief that's been going on for so many years. So that's not a surprise. But then we had our president speak to us last night, and it didn't go over very well. Matter of fact, things got worse during the night in the markets. And it might be, it's not like saying, see, it's all Trump's fault. He may have gave a bad speech, but he has a mess that he contributed to, and it's been around. There's no easy answer to it, and little hype doesn't work anymore. And I think it tells us about, I did this little pamphlet not too long ago on bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And this is, to me, exactly what happens in bankruptcy. Everything goes haywire. So his speech didn't work so well. But one thing that caught my attention, as well as many others, and that is nobody can leave Europe and come to America. And we already just got notice that we have a relative, grandchild relative type, it's stranded in Europe. And do they have a way of getting home? They have no idea how long they'll be there, what they can do. But that's just one little thing. So, even if we can avoid the immediate crisis of some of these problems, once they start interfering with travel, that is a big deal. And I think that had contributed a lot. But a lot of this would have happened. You can't say, and they would like to say that the markets have crashed because of the virus. The virus did all this. I don't happen to believe that. I think it maybe has ignited it and made it worse, and the overreaction, all these things come together. But believe me, enough Austrian economists in the past have predicted, the calamity that we were facing with the Federal Reserve policy of especially the past 10 years since the last crash, which was never corrected, and we've been living with that. But there was something interesting going on the House floor yesterday, and we can even get a little bit of positive out there. Once again, another vote on reining in the president's war powers. Of course, the president has spoken against all these wars and how stupid the war was in Iraq, but he's arguing his case, and his neocon employees are arguing the case that they don't want any restrictions. But the House did get a vote, which is about the third this year, and the Senate has done this. And the bill they were working on yesterday is similar to the one in the Senate, but they now will have to deal with this. But the vote was good. The American people, I think, are with that. They wouldn't be voting this way. The one thing is for sure that you can see here is on these recent votes, the war party are the Republicans. Yeah. And we want to draw attention a little bit about McCall's statement on this because he has an important position. But this is something that is a very important issue. That's what we talk about mostly, but in combination. But they also had a vote on Soleimani, and they had a vote of removing the authority to use military power, the one that was passed in 2002. Which was one that started the Afghan war. So there's positive thing there. Sentiments are changing, but right now I think we're in a phase where it's pretty hard to get anybody in charge, and even in the media, totally confused on what's coming out because they don't start with a basic correct principle, and they're trying to deal with the massive complications and the conflicts of what has happened into a system that we have talked here and predicted that it would be a calamity with a foreign policy as well as monetary policy. And right now, it's not going to go away quickly.
Yeah, it is. And the other thing, in fact, is today, this reminds us of how things happened in the past. Now, all of a sudden, we have to do a coronavirus stimulus. And the bill just happened to magically be written out there, and it just reminds me of Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste. because they're going to vote on the coronavirus stimulus today. It's got a lot of language about you got to feed the kids. It looks like, looking into the money that's in there, it looks like about $500 million for the WIC program and another almost $500 million for the Commodities Assistance Program that they're going to vote on today, and that'll be the stimulus.
Yeah, but what about it? Didn't we just do an $8 billion one?
Yeah.
Last week? And
starting to add up.
this is going to solve the problem, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you about the president's speech and to see what you thought about it, because my first reaction was, well, where does the presidential authority come from to say, hey, you can't travel from Europe to the U.S. anymore? Where does it derive from?
Why would you ask such a question? Do you think they've been asking that question they haven't been doing it for a long time, which of course is your point. How can they assume this? So, but how did we get involved in the wars?
Yeah.
Do they come and do it in a constitutional fashion? So now there's a war against a virus, and they think that take away the liberties of the individuals, make their own decisions, at the same time spend more money and deal with it only with spending more money. And it's the sustaining of the acceptance of the dollar as a currency that's going to bail out the world. It still exists because the rush now is, into treasury bills. And yet there's still not enough to go around, and the Fed's printing $195 billion a day and putting it into the repo market just to keep things alive. So it's in many ways, the liquidity is huge, but there's never enough liquidity in the right places.
Yeah, it just, you get the feeling that this Euro travel ban was not thought through very well, if it's exactly what they're doing. Because, think about the repercussions. A gentleman I know he's a professional musician, and they rely on their tours. That's their livelihood. He says he's got some dates booked in Europe. They don't know what to think. He says, I got kids to feed, and so does that mean these are all canceled? I think this is the result of the media hyping it, and then once they get the people so hyped up, the media reports on the people being hyped up.
This is not an absolute, because there are times when governments sort of sort things out and maybe help people avoid risk. But this whole principle is based on the fact that people don't take any risk anymore. They have to have safety nets. We have to have an empire to protect against people coming here and hurting us. Everything is avoiding risk. And I think that's what you're talking about, is that everybody has to depend on something. And the avoid risk is depending on the government, and they think that is going to solve the problem, which it doesn't. It usually makes it wrong when you think, how do we get into this mess? Yeah. How will us, continuing to have the same foreign policy when that's what we got into? They start a war. There are 7,000 Americans killed in that war. There's a lot of contractors killed and hundreds of thousands of other. And then we go to this resolution, and we have McCall, who's the ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and they had this, I think, significant vote. He lost.
Yeah.
Because he was his best buddy on this is Elliot Engel, who happens to be the chairman of the committee. So they are buddies, and this is part of that bipartisanship that I detest. But I also mentioned to you, I thought, now if Obama were still in charge, it would just be reversed. Obama would be taking the position of the Republicans, and the Republicans would be yelling and screaming. So all that arguing back and forth is just fanfare. But McCall had an unusually long statement on the floor, and he had a lot of feeling and emphasis on this, how horrible it is, and he's just, he just thinks if somebody wants to put the assassination of Soleimani into proper perspective, that you're some type of an evildoer.
Yeah.
And he really comes down hard. Matter of fact, he doesn't even want anybody to have the leisurely or the ability to use the word assassination. Yeah. It's not an assassination. We're killing a killer, And
justice.
Actually, the majority of the people are with them. The Democrats are with them. Republicans are with them, and that goes on. So it's a real shame on this authority that you can't rein in. Yeah. Now this is a follow-up of trying to rein in presidential powers from the Vietnam War. The War Powers Resolution, which is a mixed bag because it was poorly written, and now they're trying to. But these resolutions that have been passed in the last 6 months or so have always been: you can't go to war with Iran without congressional approval. Yeah. Don't you think that's been the most important thrust?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, Representative McCall, as we know, he's not a mean fellow. He's a decent personality.
Absolutely.
But sadly, I mean, he's the poster child for why we need a non-interventionist foreign policy. Because if you watch the speech, if you read the speech, literally everything he says is wrong, objectively, provably wrong. But this is one is sort of a sneaky deception. He's not the only one guilty of this, but he certainly repeated it in his speech. He said, arguing against the War Powers Resolution to restrict the president's ability to go to war with Iran without authorization, he said, this will be the 5th time that this Congress is considering a resolution to withdraw U.S. forces from wars we are not fighting, 3 on Iran and 2 on Yemen. But this is a trick because Congress refuses to declare war, they refuse to debate war, they refuse to call it a war. So when the president moves troops over and sends bombs over and sends bombs to the Saudis to bomb the Yemenis, when he does all of these things, well, we can't call it a war because Congress didn't call it a war, so Congress can't call off the war because they never called it to begin with.
You know, you named all the important things, except I'd add one thing, and that is sanctions.
Yeah.
Sanctions are not part of a war, so they say. But sanctions are vicious, and you can connect the sanctions even with this disaster that is being described about the coronavirus. And one of the hot spots in the world where there's more sickness from the virus is in Iran.
Yeah.
And they've made the point, well, you know, we can't get the medications.
Yeah.
Remember how many children died in Iraq when we were bombing and put sanctions on for 10 years? And our administration admitted that probably 500,000 kids died with our position there. And now we continue with this policy. But Iran, is not allowed. And then they say, well, we're not at war with them. And all we have to do is just envision that map. They're totally surrounded. They're intimidated. Their funds are frozen. They can't get medications for their kids, and then we're not at war with them. So it's just a lot of trading of words, and trying to deceive the people into thinking that Soleimani, if we describe him as the most evil man that ever existed, and we certainly can't describe him as the most gentle man in history, but I see people like this, I see the Taliban like this, as people who are defending their homeland.
Yeah.
The Taliban, I think there was an article this week that gave them a lot of credit for really being able to get rid of Al-Qaeda. Yeah. I thought Al-Qaeda was our enemy.
Yeah.
And so it goes on and on, but we've been on the wrong side of that, and of course, it all boils down to our position on foreign policy. What do we have these troops over there for? And then why do we get involved in the assassination of somebody that is involved in trying to sort some of this out? And as long as we have that policy, this is going to continue. And also, he said that we do this because we want to stop war. But recently, since the Soleimani example, it's been a boost. There's more killing. More Americans are dying on this. And they don't even mention whether there are any contractors dying. But there's been 2 recent episodes where American soldiers have been killed in Iraq.
Yeah. Again, everything that he said was wrong. Here's one of the things that McCall said. Soleimani was the mastermind of terror in the Middle East for 2 decades. My question is, why did the U.S. partner with him, not once, but several times, most recently under the Trump administration, where U.S. military officials were photographed next to Soleimani because he was the architect of the fight against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. So if he is the mastermind of terror, then why is he our ally during that? And also, terrorists are non-state actors, essentially, and he was an officer in the Iranian military. But the other thing he said that's important, because this is repeated over and over, he has the blood of 600 Americans on his hands, and that's been used to justify the killing. But the fact of the matter is, what he's doing is taking all of the Americans killed by roadside bombs in Iraq and blaming it on Soleimani, which is simply not the case, and it's not possible. And, Matthew Ho and a few others we know who were stationed there, they said, we saw the IEDs. They were not imported from Iran. They were homemade. They were primitive, homemade Iraqi bombs fighting what they viewed as the American invaders into their homeland. And this doesn't justify killing Americans. We don't glorify it, but don't blame Soleimani and the people who viewed Americans as invaders. Blame the neocons who lied us into war and forced our troops to be invading a country where they didn't belong and set them up to be killed like this. That's who really deserve the blame.
This is sort of a follow-up from yesterday when we said there was a war going on between Trump and Pompeo.
Yeah.
And some days, Pompeo looks like he's going to be the total victor, but he probably has more people in important places, like in the media and other places, that is on his side.
Yeah.
And the president. But anyway, that just causes frustration because the president has a position which I think is personal, but it doesn't reflect his policy.
Yeah.
And that's where the real problem is. I liked his policies when he was a candidate. He was pretty adamant, and he became the peace candidate.
Yeah, that's why he won.
Hillary wasn't a peace candidate, so they were very satisfied with Trump on the foreign policy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I can't let a couple more McCallisms pass, because he said, well, Soleimani was going to Tehran to plan future attacks. Well, that was dropped by the White House and the State Department almost immediately when we had to do this because they even, in Esper, the Secretary of Defense said, I hadn't seen any intelligence that said that. So not even the White House is claiming this anymore. Trump just said, well, he was a bad guy, I killed him, so what? But so McCall is still doing this. But the other thing that really got me is that one of the bill of particulars against Soleimani, according to McCall, is that Soleimani is the one who convinced Russia to fight for Assad. Well, yeah, against who? ISIS and Al-Qaeda, right? So that's a bad thing. And he said tens of thousands of innocent people are dead today, victims of war crimes because of Soleimani. No, they're dead because the U.S. government and its allies came up with the boneheaded idea of arming terrorists to overthrow Assad. That's what started it. He wasn't killing people before this happened. He wasn't killing people before Al-Qaeda was given all the weapons to overthrow him by the U.S., Turkey, and other allies in the region. So, again, it's just hard. I mean, everything is just so wrong with what he said.
Well, it's been an endless fight for our side because they have a political and they have a monetary need to have an enemy, and ISIS is the enemy, and terrorism has been the fall guy. And all they have to do, whether it's domestic or foreign now, is they use that word and it automatically paints them. You can be a domestic individual that got too close or got on the phone or something. It's terrorist. And terrorism, you don't have to wait till you try them and find out if they're really a terrorist. It's just labeled. If they're labeled and it's out there, then they have to go and get rid of them.
Kill them. Yeah.
So it's a policy that is totally out of control. And when you put it together with the inbred financial calamity that we're facing, with our spending and our Federal Reserve mechanisms. And then also when you have this type of a foreign policy, and then along comes a virus, and we've talked about that quite a bit already. Why do people use that too? I mean, it's a political thing that they use it for. It's a spending thing. Do they think that the more money they spend, the more likely is that the virus is going to go away? And they don't spend, how much money do they spend on influenza? Killing 30,000, 40,000 Americans a year,
Yeah.
some years. So people die from this, but no, there's I think 1,800 or something. It's serious, of course, it is, but so there's a lot of other ways people die in this country, and they don't serve the benefits of those who would like to take over. This idea of power, I think, is a strong motivation for what's going on, whether we're in a foreign policy or the monetary system or dealing with coronavirus.
Yeah.
Power, because they think that people are incapable of sorting out risk, and you and I should have the right to take a risk and go places where we want, as long as the people that we go to see and visit accept our presence. You know, it's the whole, all back to private property, and both sides agreeing to it. And, you know, if schools weren't run by a totally monopolistic, authoritarian central government, they couldn't be one edict, you know, on how people can do that. You know, I know some people, and maybe even in this room, who do homeschooling. Yeah. You don't have to worry about that problem. The virus comes along, well, we'll give them their medication, but we don't have to expose them to everything the government wants to do. But people quite frankly don't accept that or believe it, because we've been conditioned, because that's why we have a free country, because we have free education, and yet we have people running for the presidency now. They want to really make it free and whether it's college or everything else, everything is for free, no risk, no work, just print the money, and everything is going to be okay. It's the end of the line. It's quickly fading away, and they better start talking about the kind of system that we want, rather than just trying to grab a political advantage for today, tomorrow, and the next day. They better start thinking, well, maybe there's a better way to handle infectious diseases, maybe a better way to handle the monetary system, and of course, there's a better way to manage our foreign policy.
Yeah, you know, when you were saying there's a lot of ways people die, I was thinking all of these people panicking over coronavirus are driving their big carts through the store full with soda pop, you know, carts full of it, and how many people are dying of diabetes. So there's the irony there. I would just close, Dr. Paul, by saying, you know, Representative McCall is not a bad guy necessarily, but he really is the best example of why we should not intervene overseas, because the people who are doing the intervening have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. That's the bottom line of why we shouldn't get involved.
Very good, and I certainly agree with you that separating the personalities with their policies is a job that we must face. And he's had a policy, that's Mike McCall, and like Daniel says, he's easygoing. Matter of fact, he came to one of our meetings one time, Daniel, if you remember, and I was hoping maybe he's coming with us. And but he's not going to do any yelling and screaming. His speech, I think, on the House floor yesterday caught our attention, because when you read it, it sounds like yelling and screaming. You're a bunch of idiots if you don't agree with me. On a personal basis, he's not like that. But unfortunately, he's accepting the very policies and everything that he pretends that will happen if we don't do this and give the power to the president is absolutely what happens when we have a president, an executive branch of government, that goes to war at will and will not accept any restraint. The trouble, one big trouble is this whole war powers resolution and restraining the president. Once it's accepted, it's hard to put it back in the bag, you know, because they've rejected the whole notion that we don't need the constitutional restraints, and that's why we have a war power resolution to counteract the illegal wars of Korea and Vietnam. And this is an attempt to correct a mistake by doing the same thing over and over again. But anyway, I'm still a believer that there's enough people, especially like yesterday. The people in Congress responded to what the American people's position was on restraining the president. Yeah, they weren't all honorable. Some of them did it because they just hate the president and for other reasons. But they would not do this if they didn't know that the American people are sick and tired of these wars and sick and tired of all this nonsense. And I think they're going to be sick and tired of the restraints placed on them in their travels from Europe to America. And when they were passing the Patriot Act a couple days after 9/11, people were frightened and scared to death and were very excited about being made safe again. But Guess who suffered the consequences? The American people. The Patriot Act has nothing to do with making us safer. It has a lot to do with giving an excuse to the authoritarians to undermine our personal liberties. And that's what a free country is all about: protecting civil liberties, protecting the liberties of individuals, protecting those who refuse to hurt other people and live with other people and accommodate, even if they disagree with the way they live and what kind of a lifestyle they have. And that would go a long way to making the world more peaceful and more secure. And that is to take the pledge that we as a nation should never initiate aggression. And quite frankly, regardless of the speeches in Washington, we are most of the time the aggressors. And you say, no, Soleimani is the aggressor. Now, that is not the case. We have to go 6,000 to 7,000 miles and deliver bombs. This time around, they said, well, we had to retaliate. They shot down one of our drones, over Iran. That's why we have to go after Soleimani. And they'll make up stories. So because Iran shot down a drone that we were flying over their territory, therefore we have to go to war with them. Oh no, we don't go to war with them. We're just going to punish them a little bit and teach them a lesson so that they get rid of their leaders. And we know about that, never working. But I do want to sincerely thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report and the support we get from you. And please come back soon.